Hi there, welcome back to Mudwalkers. My name is Chris. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, the follow button, whatever you're watching this on. Go ahead and hit those buttons, like, share, subscribe, all the things. There's also a link tree down below if you'd like to check out my social media. There's a Patreon link in the description below if you'd like to support what I do. And basically, let's get into it. This is an article that I found very early on in my naturist journey. I was trying to figure out what the Bible said about the whole thing, and when the Bible didn't really have a whole lot to offer, I started looking at articles and books and all that good stuff and podcasts. And this is one of the early articles that I found. It's an article by John Piper. The link will be in the description below. And even as a 17-year-old, because this would have been late 2012, maybe sometime in 2013, I was about 17 years old. And even at that age, the article just struck me as kind of fishy. Let's take a look. The first consequence of Adam's and Eve's sin mentioned in Genesis 3:7 is that, quote, "The eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." So, yeah, no argument so far so good. It's in the next paragraph where things kind of start to get off the rails. Suddenly, they are self-conscious about their bodies. Before their rebellion against God, there was no shame. Quote, "The man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed." Genesis 2:25. Now there is shame. Why? Right there, Piper makes two really big claims from not a whole lot of biblical data. He said Adam and Eve felt self-conscious, and he said that they felt shame. The verse doesn't say that. He's inferring a lot of ideas into this verse. So this is really where the article picks up, and we're going to see that this problem kind of pervades the rest of what Piper's going to get at, for the most part. He said they were self-conscious of their bodies. The text says they realized they were naked. Now, I can tell you as a naturist, which is a type of nudist, I have a whole video about that, Naturism 101, whichever side it is. Is it this side? I think it's this side. And in the video, I go over what all these different words mean, but naturist and nudist, for our purposes here, interchangeable. So, as a naturist, I spend a lot of time naked, and there are times when I'll be sitting down, doing work, editing videos, reading a book, whatever it is, naked, and I'll put my things aside, and I'll go to stand up and go back into the room, and realize, oh, yeah, I kind of forgot I didn't have any clothes on. So, naturists can realize that they're naked. That doesn't equate to self-consciousness. Just because I stand up and remember, oh, right, I'm naked, that doesn't mean that I'm self-conscious about anything. And covering up doesn't have to mean shame. So I want to know where he got those ideas from, because they don't seem to have come from the verse. The shame in particular is very interesting to me, because not only is there no reference to Adam or Eve feeling shame in Genesis 2 or 3, but there's no verse in the entire Bible that says that Adam or Eve felt shame in the entire situation here. So I would challenge you, if you think I'm wrong, by all means, go and find the verse and post it in the comments below. I think you'll very quickly find that I'm right, though, that the verse doesn't exist. The point of mentioning the lack of shame in Genesis 2:25 is not to somehow contrast a lack of shame before the fall with a presence of shame after the fall, because we don't find shame after the fall. What Moses is getting at is the cultural perception of nudity in the Bronze Age when he was writing the Torah, because by then they had a whole cultural matrix around clothing and nakedness and honor and dishonor. So if you were well off, if you were wealthy, that was a position of great honor. But if you were poor, that was the opposite. It was a state of dishonor, and you were not well looked on by your community. And if you had only your house and your goats left and a little bit of land and your clothes and a few other articles, little tools or tables or chairs or whatever, then if you lost your means and you had to start selling things off, well, you'd start with the tools and furniture. You'd sell off the goats because that's food. You'd sell off the house, the land. The last thing you would want to give up is your clothes, because you kind of need those to live. All through the Bible, wherever we find a rationale given for clothing the naked, we find cold temperatures. It's a matter of protecting people. So it was clear in the time of Moses that you needed clothes or you were going to die. So if clothes were the last thing you would dare to sell when you were suffering in poverty, then what would your conclusion be if you saw a whole family completely naked walking down the street? Ah, these people have nothing, which is a terrible place to be. This is a state of complete and total dishonor. Your family isn't providing for you. Your community isn't providing for you. The gods are not providing for you. So something's wrong with you. What did you do to anger the gods? This is the same attitude we find in the book of Job, by the way. When Job suddenly starts losing his possessions, he enters a state of dishonor and his friends no longer trust him. So when this culture has already developed and then Moses is writing the Torah, or whoever wrote the Torah, I think it was probably Moses, but when Moses is writing the Torah here, when the author is writing this section and he gets to this part where he has to remind the readers, by the way, Adam and Eve were naked, he has to put in here, now I know that sounds bad. I know that they were naked and that sounds like dishonor, but just so you know, it wasn't dishonor. There was no shame in them being poor. There was no shame in them being naked. There was no shame in them having no possessions because they were well taken care of. That's my guess about why the author presents this as if it's not a bad thing, is because it wasn't, because they had everything that they needed. They didn't need to own things because there was total harmony. Why would you need to have possessions in a place of total harmony? So even though nakedness would have been deeply dishonorable for Moses' contemporaries, he's reminding them that for Adam and Eve, it was not so. I talk about Genesis chapter 3 in a dedicated video up here. And I also have another video going over a great textbook called Clothing and Nudity in the Hebrew Bible. If I got the title wrong, I'll correct myself right here. But if you haven't seen that video, it's a long one, but it goes into depth with a lot of these cultural points, showing historically, archaeologically, anthropologically, that these claims I'm making hold up. I do have sources, and they're in that video. So if you haven't seen it, go ahead and check it out. Okay, the next 7 paragraphs of the article deal with what Piper calls the 2 sources of shame here in Genesis chapter 3. Now, the paragraphs are all kind of one continuous idea, so I couldn't find a great place to split up between those and comment in between the paragraphs, because I would basically just be interrupting him in his flow of thought. But instead, I've included a short, sampling of things from those paragraphs to kind of show the gist of what he's getting at. By all means, go read Piper's article yourself. If I got it wrong, let me know in the comments and shame me as publicly as you want. But here's the gist of it. What he's getting at is that the 2 kinds of shame are introspective and interpersonal. So let's start with interpersonal. The interpersonal one is that when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, the vulnerability of their nakedness became extreme, and they could no longer trust the other person because clearly each person was capable and guilty of deep betrayal and total violation of expectations. So, of course, you would distrust the other person now, according to Piper. But then you have the introspective one, which is, wow, what have I done? I'm so guilty. I deserve shame. So let me shame myself with these coverings. Is kind of my understanding of what he said. But here's some excerpts, like I said. Not excerpts, it's actually just the 7th paragraph. Just show the paragraph. So, the shame of nakedness arises from 2 sources, and both of them are owing to the collapse of the foundation of covenant love in our relationship with God. One is that Eve is no longer reliable to cherish me. She has become selfish, and I feel vulnerable that she will put me down for her own selfish ends. The other is that I already know that I am guilty myself, and the nakedness of innocence contradicts my unworthiness. I am ashamed of it. There you have it. If I missed anything from the 6 missing paragraphs, by all means let me know in the comments and shame me as publicly as you like. What I want you to notice the most, though, here is that Piper takes a fairly short sentence, a very small data set, and he expounds this huge amount of information where the text wasn't even dealing with those categories. The verse says 2 things. They realized they were naked, and they covered themselves with fig leaves. But with Piper's article here, we get this whole 7-paragraph psychological dissertation about what they were thinking and feeling and why, and I don't see how we get that from the text. I had a longer thing I was going to get into, but let me just sum it up thusly, which is something I tell people about Genesis chapter 3 all the time with a variety of different verses in the passage, which is this. If it was that important, the author would say it. So if all these emotional states that John Piper's talking about were really crucial to what's going on here, the author would have told us these things. He didn't, so they're not very important. I know that hurts to hear sometimes, but the Bible's not that interested in things that it's not saying. If something isn't being said, it's not that pertinent to what's going on. Now, cultural data can be very important, like what we saw with Genesis 2:25. And cultural data helps us a lot with those things. But trying to infer a lot of the motivations and emotional states and things in the passage based on just short phrases doesn't really, it's not a very responsible use of the text. The only emotional state we really get access to in this passage is when Adam tells God in one verse or the other that he hid from God because he was terrified, which is an understandable emotion, but that's the only emotion that we really get access to, or some kind of psychological statement is just fear, and that's not the same thing as shame. YouTube is cracking down on naturist content creators pretty hard, especially here lately. There have been some new developments with other naturist content creators that I'll not get into, but they're not happy about us being on the platform, despite the fact that what we do is carefully kept within community guidelines. The kind of content that we're making is not real popular with the algorithm. So even though Mudwalkers is making a lot of progress, and I'm getting close to some metrics that would potentially let me monetize here on YouTube, I don't have to worry about that too much because I have patrons over on Patreon. Here they are, right here. Guys, all of you, thank you so much for everything you're doing on Patreon. You're making the channel possible. You're keeping my work sustainable. The things that I'm doing, the places that I'm going, I would not be able to do this without you. I'm planning a bunch of trips in 2024. We'll see how many of them I actually get done, but thanks to you guys, I can actually contemplate travel for the channel, which is, pretty huge. We have really affordable options. We have a $5 option and a $10 option. The $5 option and $10 option both get early access to all my content, as much of it as I'm able to upload early, which is almost everything. And then the $10 option also gets access to a monthly Zoom conversation, video call with me and the other $10 patrons, $10 and above. But it's a great time for us to hang out and share stories and swap ideas, and it's by far one of my favorite parts of having Patreon. It's just great. I get to rub shoulders and hang out with all kinds of people from around the world, people I would never have met without Patreon. So a big thank you to my patrons. Now back to the video. Genesis 3:7 says that they tried to cope with this new situation by making clothing. Quote, they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Adam's and Eve's effort to clothe themselves was a sinful effort to conceal what had really happened. They tried to hide from God, Genesis 3:8. Their nakedness felt too revealing and too vulnerable. So they tried to close the gap between what they were and what they ought to be by covering what is and presenting themselves in a new way. Again, it just seems like he's reading way too much into these verses. That being said, this part is pretty legit. I like this part. It actually helps tie the passage into Genesis chapter 42. In Genesis 42:9, Joseph, who's kind of the second in command of Egypt at the time, likens the military vulnerability of Egypt to nudity. And so that shows that nakedness was more than just not having your clothes on. It could also mean intense vulnerability to danger. So I actually like that sentence, that little section from the paragraph. I like that bit. But then he gets right back to saying things that the passage doesn't say, which is not great. They tried to close the gap between what they were and what they ought to be by covering what is and presenting themselves in a new way. You can't get all of that from the words, they made themselves loincloths. Now we get to see John Piper's interpretation of verse 20. And Yahweh made skinned garments for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Again, Piper goes into great depth, and he waxes poetic about the lost glory of mankind, the promise to restore our glory as indicated by our clothes, the necessity to wear clothes all the time because of this whole glory scenario. But none of that comes from Genesis 2:20. The verse says two things, and two things only. God made skin garments, and God gave the skin garment to some people. That's it. There isn't a rule in this verse that says that Adam and Eve had to wear clothes for whatever reason, sexual reasons, ritual purity reasons, or what have you. There's no requirement here for them to wear these clothes all the time. He gives them to them. He clothed them with them, which is not the same thing as a rule. If a gift is a rule, then our lives are going to get really complicated and silly really fast, because there are a lot of gifts given in the Bible, lots of gifts given by God, and those can't all be rules. So the fact that God gave Adam and Eve something doesn't mean that it's mandatory for everyone. One quick example is that God gave Adam a wife. Is everyone supposed to marry a woman? No. I mean, God also gave Eve a son. Does that mean that everyone has a moral mandate to reproduce? No. So, I mean, you can go on and on and on and on down the list of the gifts that God gives people in Scripture, and they just don't come out as rules. And I don't see a reason to take this one as a rule without some kind of compelling reason, because, like I said, it being a gift is not enough. He goes on for another 7 paragraphs about this short sentence, and it would be really long and boring for me to just read it out. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to show you some excerpts from what he wrote in the 7 paragraphs. And like I said, by all means, check the article and let me know if I missed something. Negatively, he is saying, you are not what you were, and you are not what you ought to be. The chasm between what you are and what you ought to be is huge. Covering yourself with clothing is a right response to this, not to conceal it, but to confess it. Henceforth, you shall wear clothing, not to conceal that you are not what you should be, but to confess that you are not what you should be. One practical implication of this is that public nudity today is not a return to innocence, but rebellion against moral reality. God ordains clothes to witness to the glory that we have lost, and it is added rebellion to throw them off. Our clothes are a witness both to our past and present failure and to our future glory. They testify to the chasm between what we are and what we should be, and they testify to God's merciful intention to bridge that chasm through Jesus Christ and his death for our sins. Again, he gets all that from God made something, and then God gave that thing to somebody. You just can't get all of that from that verse. All the stuff that we just went over, all that data he gets from that short sentence. Now, I'm not saying the gifts here are unimportant. Of course they're important. I have a whole video about Genesis chapter 3 where I go into that, and I talk in particular about what my view of the garments is, and I actually think that my view is more beautiful and more powerful than the conventional view. Of course, it doesn't make it right. That's just my own perception of it, but the video's up here. Just click that and check it out. It's great. The short version is that God just cursed them with a thorny, harsh world, and then he immediately, mercifully, gives them ideal clothing, protective clothing against that environment. There's just about nothing more protective for their time period against thorns than leather garments or hide or whatever you want to call it. It was really great. So God is giving them something to protect them because he's a nice person, and he's setting a great example for clothing the naked. Also, he says that taking our clothes off is rebellious, but it seems like there has to be a rule or some kind of expressed expectation from an authority figure for something to count as rebellion. There isn't a rule against it, so it's difficult to see how it could be seen as, totally rebellious. That's odd to me. I'm not sure why that would be the case. For example, there's no rule in the Bible that says all humans have to eat the sheaths of legumes, like a green bean. Or is that even a legume? Let's make it bananas. There's no rule in the Bible that says everyone has to eat bananas. But then I make the claim that if you don't eat bananas, that's an act of rebellion against God. There's no rule that says we have to eat bananas or not eat bananas. Anyway, if God has a rule about something and you violate that rule, of course that's an act of rebellion if it's deliberate. But without a rule, there's no rebellion. Without the law, there is no sin. So you got to have a law for there to be sin. There's no law against this, so how come it's sin? How come it's rebellious if there's no rule, no expressed expectation? I have a video going over the whole rule, not rule question here. It's actually one of my pet topics about the whole modesty issue, is that one. But I also have another video where the whole question of historical nakedness comes up. Cultural and historical nakedness comes up quite a bit. One of my favorite portions of Mudwalkers ever is the world map section in this video. So even if you just go to that video, the Got Questions video, and just scroll through that little bar at the bottom till you find a world map and just watch that section, that's what I'm getting at. It kind of speaks for itself. So the summary of what I have to say about the article is the article says an awful lot of beautiful, pious things, very few of which have anything to do with Genesis chapter 3, unfortunately. Now, I will say, John Piper is clearly a gifted writer. It has flow, it has tempo, it has structure. It's inspiring and exciting to read. It's fun to read. And it's, like I said, it's just beautiful. It's poetic. It flows. I can see why people find his written materials, so compelling. But unfortunately, this article here is deeply eisegetical. I say the word eisegesis deliberately, as in with deliberation. I did think that one through, because eisegesis means taking a foreign idea and putting it in a text that doesn't concern that issue, that isn't concerned with that issue, and then trying to pass the passage off as if it is dealing with that issue. So, for example, John 3:16, a lot of us Christians know that one. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. If I try to make that verse say something about diet, then that's eisegesis, because the passage isn't talking about that at all. But I'm taking an idea foreign to that verse and putting it into the verse. The eis there at the beginning is into. Eisegesis versus exegesis, which is finding the ideas in the verse and taking them out for our own learning. Pulling the actual content up and out. Exegesis versus eisegesis. And this article is eisegeting this whole modesty and shame and glory thing into these brief verses that are not concerned with the issue. So it is eisegesis. That is not to say that I think that John Piper is being deceptive here. I don't think he is. Everything that I've ever heard about John Piper leads me to the conclusion that John Piper is as kind and genuine and compassionate as they come. I think that he is totally sincere in these views, or else he would not have written them this way. I think he honestly believes the text does actually teach this. Unfortunately, he's sincerely wrong in his sincerity. So please don't take this as a dig on John Piper's character, because it's not. I think he based on everything I've heard of him, he's a great guy. I think he's probably a really nice person and all these things, because I've interacted with people online who've met him in person and even worked with him at ministry events and things, and he's just a really, really stand-up, solid gold type of person, a great person. So I don't think he's a terrible person, and I don't think he's trying to deceive anybody. I think he's being totally honest, and he's just honestly wrong. I want to challenge you, dear viewer, read the entire article from John Piper, link in the description, read through it thoughtfully, and just ask yourself if the passage really is talking about what he's talking about. Ask yourself if these short quoted phrases really translate into all these paragraphs of psychological data that Piper gives here. My conclusion is that you can't get that from what he's talking about. I even have textile friends who read this article when I sent it to them and said, yeah, like, these people generally like John Piper and his materials and his beliefs, but these people read the article and said, yeah, that the article is not compelling. That's not what the passage is getting at, which is gratifying. These people aren't even naturists, but they can see that the article is not actually dealing directly with what the passage is trying to convey. So ask yourself if these things really mean what Piper says. They knew that they were naked, means that Adam and Eve were afraid of each other because each knew that the other was now morally corrupt, that they were deeply aware of their guilt before God and believed that they themselves were worthy of being shamed, and that they actually did feel shame. They sewed fig leaves together and clothed themselves means that they wanted to cover up the true nature of what had transpired and sought to present the situation in a new light. God made clothes and clothed them means that God was acknowledging the glory mankind had lost and was promising to restore that glory through the victory of the Messiah. So, my question to you, dear viewer, my beloved non-nudist, non-naturist, my clothing-wearing friend, I have two big questions for you about this passage. One, where is the rule that says that human beings have to wear clothes? Because I don't see one here. I see God giving a gift. I see Adam and Eve having some kind of epiphany and putting fig leaves on. But a person doing a thing in a story is not the same thing as a rule, and God giving someone a gift is not the same thing as a rule. Second question, where does the passage say that Adam and Eve felt shame? Because I can't find it. Food for thought. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was, that it inspires some reading and some critical thought. If you think I'm wrong, by all means, tell me in the comments or send me a DM on social media. Linktree in the description for my social media if you'd like to get in touch with me directly. Because I know that I could be wrong about things. And the whole reason why I became a naturist in the first place is because I changed my mind about conventional modesty. I started out in the same boat as John Piper here. I would have said that the passage taught that we should, practice traditional, conventional, American, evangelical type modesty. I would have said that the passage taught that, but then I studied it and changed my mind. So with more study and compelling arguments, I could change my mind again. So by all means, if you think I got this wrong, let me know. But I also want to ask, have you ever realized that something, anything, even a tiny thing that you believed wasn't quite the way that you used to believe it? It wasn't actually the same way that you believed. Maybe you changed your mind about something, you changed your beliefs about something. Just open yourself up to the possibility that this could be another one of those cases. Now, as a caveat, for my Christian non-nudists out there, just real quick before the video is over, I'm not trying to say that we should just run off naked into church, run off naked into Walmart. That's not what I'm getting at. That would be unloving. I think that the best argument we have for modesty in the Bible is love your neighbor as yourself. Would you want to do something? Would you want people to do something around you where just you being in the same room as that brings you moral guilt? Would you want people to do that to you? No, then do to others as you would have them do unto you. I wouldn't want someone doing something in that category to me, so I'm not going to do that to someone else. I wouldn't want people doing something to me that was extremely offensive and mentally disturbing. So I'm not going to walk around naked around a bunch of people who aren't interested in seeing that, and that they're going to be that bothered by it, offended by it. That's not what I'm going after. What I'm going after is, the Bible doesn't have a rule against this. So in settings where it can be appropriate, where no one is going to be harmed by nudity, because people in the West are so sheltered from nudity that it actually can disturb them. But in inappropriate settings where everyone is cool with it, it's not going to bother anybody, and there's no rule against it, then live and let live. Romans chapter 14, don't pass judgment on a brother. But I just wanted to comfort you with that before we go, and the video is officially over.